All right, we are going to get started now. So good morning, everyone. I'm Amy Clausen with the Niagara-on-the-Lake Museum, and this is the first in the series of virtual lectures for 2024. We're happy to be back. Hope you guys are warm and cozy in your houses with a coffee or a tea or something, and you can sit back and relax today and listening to our presentation. We're recording today's presentation as we normally do, and we'll upload it to our YouTube channel afterwards. So for some reason you lose your connection or you have to leave early, don't worry, we will send you the link to the recording. And as always, you can put questions or comments in the chat and Q&A boxes, and we will field those questions to our presenter at the end of the presentation. Also, if you want to support any of our programming here, especially our free programming like the lecture series, you can do so through our donation page, and I'll put that link in the chat box as well. So our current exhibition right now is called Strike a Pose, The Art of Self-Obsession, which looks at art and photographs from early portraits to selfies today. So we thought we would start off our series exploring some of those themes. And today we have with us our friend Debra Antoncic from just down the road at Riverbrink in Queenston. Debra is the director-curator at Riverbrink Art Museum, and as an art historian and curator, she has curated numerous exhibitions of historical and contemporary art. She holds a PhD in art history from Queen's University and a combined Master of Arts and curatorial diploma from York University with a specialty in post-war Canadian art and visual culture. So I will turn it over to you, Debra, and welcome.
Thank you, Amy. Thank you for the lovely introduction, and welcome to all of you who are joining this virtual lecture. It's really been it's a very vast topic, and it has a long history and so many wonderful examples. So it's really been a challenge for me to select work that to talk about today. So I'm sure there will be some of your favorites that I've missed, but I think I've chosen some good examples, and I've chosen to focus on examples of portraits as commemoration and as propaganda, and the use of portraiture to establish identity. To begin with, I'm showing a wonderful example of the portrait as propaganda. This life-size portrait in marble of the Roman Emperor Augustus is shown in the act of addressing his troops. It's from the collection of the Vatican museums. Augustus is wearing this highly decorated cuirass or breastplate, and his cloak is draped over one arm. The sculpture has many references to the emperor's life and achievements, so it's more than just a portrait of Augustus as an orator and a general, but it tells us about the emperor's power and the ideology behind his rule. He is shown as a great military leader and a military victor, and a staunch supporter of Roman religious beliefs. Elements of the sculptural decoration claim and predict the 200 years of the Pax, what is known as the Pax Romana. The decoration of the breastplate shows important events in the rule of Augustus. In the center is a depiction of the return of the Roman standard lost in a humiliating defeat to the Parthians. And the return of the standard was a diplomatic rather than a military victory. And so it reminds the viewer of the peaceful outcome of this great leader, new leader of ancient Rome, and the emphasis on peace rather than the chaos of the civil war that had preceded. Around this central image of the return of the standards are personifications of gods and goddesses. The goddess Tellus is at the bottom, and she's the goddess of plenty, holding a cornucopia and two healthy babies. So a reference to the peace and prosperity that will come with Augustus's rule. The pose is what is called contrapposto, so a stance that animates the figure with one leg forward and one leg back, holding the weight, and then an opposing arm stretched outward. And I'm also showing a contemporary recreation of how the sculpture would have looked back in the day. So with this quite decorative polychromy, which I think always comes as a bit of a shock to us, as we're used to seeing sculptures in marble and white or a brownish kind of color. So in its time, it would have been quite decorated with color. So the pose, the contrapposto, connects the sculpture, the portrait, to the sculpture of ancient Greece, to the Golden Age of 5th century BCE. And this also connects Augustus to the previous civilization. There are many additional references, such as the Cupid down in the lower left. This supports the claim that Augustus, although mortal, was a descendant of the god Venus, the Roman goddess of love. Cupid is riding a dolphin, so that symbolizes the great naval victory that Augustus achieved over Antony and Cleopatra. The figure is idealized and youthful, with the body of an athlete. So all of the messages in this portrait, and I've only touched on a few of them, there are many, many more on the back. The messages are complex, and essentially all are designed to promote the legitimacy and the accomplishments of the emperor. And he's presented as timeless and godlike, even though, and barefoot, mortal, but still with this reference to divinity. Subsequent traditions in Roman portraiture emphasized realism rather than an idealized representation. And during the Flavian period, when this portrait was produced, we have examples of portraits of people of all ages. Very little is known about this particular work. It's in the collection of the Capitolino Museum in Rome. But it's one example of this very wonderful contrast of this very elaborate headdress, this elaborate coiffure, and the smooth skin. And it's thought to have been done from life. So very wonderful traditions of portraiture from ancient Rome. Painted portraits from roughly the same time. Here I'm showing one of the funerary portraits from Fayoum in Egypt, an area about 150 miles south of Alexandria. So this is from roughly the same time period of Roman rule in Egypt, around the same time as the ruler Augustus. And these portraits served a commemorative purpose as a funerary portrait for use in mummification. They are some of the earliest known and best preserved and most finely painted portraits in the history of art. They're painted on wooden boards using pigments such as tempera and beeswax, so an encaustic preparation. And they would have been placed over the mummy and tied with linen wrappings. They were also done from life, so likely done well before the individual passed away, but in preparation for death and the afterlife. Additional details are picked out in gold, symbolizing divinity and eternity. And these reflect the tremendous expense lavished on these portraits and the popularity of the portraits among the wealthy at this time. There are really hundreds in a large area that has been excavated, as I said, about just outside of Alexandria, all by, unfortunately, anonymous artists, but really a very interesting tradition in portraiture at this time. With the collapse of Roman civilization, portraiture had essentially disappeared in Western Europe. Only such figures as saints and the Virgin and Child, angels, and here we have an example of the crucifixion. These were the only figures depicted, although rulers, in imitation of Roman and Byzantine emperors' precedents, would have possibly commissioned a fairly generic profile in a coin. Portraiture began to reappear in the 15th century, but not as we know portraits today, but as devotional images, such as in this fresco by the early Renaissance painter Masaccio. The artist included portraits of the patrons Lorenzo Lenzi and his wife, and you'll see them on either side of the crucifixion in this wall fresco from Florence. So this is when we see portraiture starting to reappear in this limited form. Portraits of patrons also began to appear on altarpieces as observers of a biblical story. For instance, here, the Merode altarpiece attributed to the workshop of Robert Campin, 1428 to 32, approximately, in the collection of the cloisters, so in the collection of the Metropolitan Museum. The patron is shown here on the left, kneeling at an open door, and he's watching the story of the Annunciation, the moment when the angel announces to the Virgin that she will bear Christ, a story from the Bible. So the patron is shown watching from the left, and on the right-hand side is a depiction of Joseph, the husband of Mary. And just showing you a detail from the triptych, the donor appears to witness the central scene with his wife kneeling behind him, and a town messenger stands at the garden gate. The enclosed space of this garden, this walled garden, is intended as a reference to the purity of the Virgin. These figures, that is, of the patron's wife and the messenger, were added later, presumably after the patron married. The donor would have purchased the triptych, an early example of Netherlandish painting, for use in private prayer and for use in the home. It's only 26 by 48 inches, so it's a good size, but more for private devotion rather than something you would find in a public religious setting. Independent standalone portraits, however, would have to wait for the change in a worldview associated with the Renaissance. A worldview centered on humanism, on the emphasis on individual achievement and recognition. Commemorative portraits of the deceased were common in the early Renaissance, and patrons commissioned portraits of themselves. Both men and women sought speaking likenesses, as they were known, for a range of purposes for the first time since antiquity. Portraits became part of the dynastic business of kingdoms and displayed aspects of wealth and status. In this portrait, the profile portrait, such as this one by Fra Filippo Lippi, was customary in Florence until about 1470. So this is the earliest surviving double portrait, the earliest surviving to show sitters in a domestic setting and with a view onto a landscape in the background from the collection of the Metropolitan Museum in New York. The woman is dressed in a French-inspired costume, and her sleeve is embroidered in Latin with letters spelling out faithful in seed pearls. And this has been taken as a clue that the man standing at the window is possibly her betrothed. He holds the Scolari family crest, so that's been taken as an indication of their identity. But it is an interesting double portrait, and also shown in profile, which was typical of the time. But this wonderful attention to the details of dress and so on. Three-quarter and full-length portraits began to appear in the late 15th century, along with bust-length portraits based on Roman precedents of the kind that we looked briefly at earlier. So this format allowed for the representation of details of the life and circumstances of the subject, along with an exploration of character. Although most were impersonal, this portrait by Botticelli is an exception in that it presents this delicate psychological study. The subject has both masculine and feminine traits, and they're combined in this wonderful image of beauty and in the collection of the National Gallery in Washington. Portraits were exchanged in marriage negotiations, so a prospective groom might seek a likeness of a proposed bride, and vice versa. And in this full-length double portrait, believed to depict the Italian merchant Giovanni di Nicolai Arnolfini and his wife, presumably in their residence in the Flemish city of Bruges, we have a portrait used to represent an event. It's in the collection of the National Gallery in London. The painting is sometimes described as, or titled, the Arnolfini wedding portrait, but there's been some speculation that it functioned as a unique form of marriage contract, among other possible discussions and descriptions of accounts and of what this actually is, what's actually going on in this painting. The illusionism of the painting was remarkable for its time, in part for the rendering of detail, but particularly for the use of light to evoke space in an interior, for an utterly convincing depiction of a room as well as the people in the room. The artist's contemporaries, the Arnolfinis, are shown engaged in some sort of action in a contemporary interior, one that is both mundane and also highly spiritual. Almost every aspect conveys the sanctity of the event, the holiness of matrimony. Although it is a portrait, it's also a genre painting, a scene of everyday life, and each of the objects would have been familiar to Flemish viewers in the traditional, as representing traditional Flemish customs. Painting in oil rather than tempera, the artist applied several layers of thin, translucent glaze to create such intensity of both tone and color. The longer drying time of oil paint gave the artist time to blend colors by painting wet in wet, to achieve these really wonderful, subtle variations in light and shade and incredible detail. Van Eyck captured surface appearances and distinguished textures precisely, conveying the material wealth of the Arnolfinis and the objects in the room in almost documentary detail. While the precise purpose of the painting is under dispute, it remains a remarkable portrait of Flemish life in the 15th century. And really no discussion of portraiture could be done without referencing this, arguably the most famous portrait in the world, the Mona Lisa by Leonardo da Vinci. It's thought to be a portrait of the wife of a wealthy Florentine named Francesco della Giocondo, and the dates of the painting are given as 1503 to 1505, although we know that Leonardo kept fussing with it for some time afterwards, and it's oil on wood. Probably in a slideshow like this one is the best view any of us are ever going to get, or closest we're ever going to get to the Mona Lisa these days, given its popularity. The painting was trimmed at one point, and it shows a woman in half-length view with her hands folded, gazing out at the viewer, an enigmatic smile on her lips. This is courtesy of Leonardo's skill with chiaroscuro, this kind of uneven application of light and dark, and atmospheric perspective. The result is the opposite of clarity. We learn really nothing of the sitter's character or personality or her life or mood because the artist's use of sfumato obscures rather than reveals her expression, and the background also a very indistinct and oddly mysterious, a hazy background in the atmospheric perspective that he's used also lends to this air of mystery that has captivated imaginations over many centuries, really, since it was first produced. And I guess I don't need to tell all of you that it's in the collection of the Louvre. So returning to Italy, this wonderful portrait of Eleonora di Toledo by Agnolo Bronzino is considered the first state portrait of a ruler's wife and heir. So here she's shown with her second male child, had quite a few children live past infancy, but this portrait confirms her role in producing an heir for the Medici dynasty in Florence. Eleanora wears this elaborate brocade dress, made of silk and gold and silver thread. Her costume is a visual reference to the role that Eleanor played in supporting Florentine industries, such as weaving and textiles, for instance, and the arts generally following her marriage to Cosimo de' Medici in Florence. The landscape in the background may refer to her interest and support of agriculture. So the portrait is therefore an important statement about the attributes of wealth and her domestic role in producing an heir, and the importance of this Spanish bride for the Medici rule in Florence. Bronzino's contemporary, Sofonisba Anguissola, another innovation in portraiture introduced by Anguissola. So this novel conception of the family portrait, it's full of charm and this informal intimacy. Like many female artists, Anguissola was denied access to the male nude model for study, and so she used family members as models. The painting shows the artist's three sisters, thought to be Lucia, Europa, and Minerva, playing chess, an intellectual game, and also then making a statement about the education of young women, young aristocratic women at this time. And also the governess, the girl's governess is there looking over their shoulder on the right. The sister to the left, thought to be Lucia, looks out at the viewer after winning the game. And the figures are positioned in a variety of poses and a variety of gazes that leads us around the circle and back out to the position of the artist, which is the looking in on the scene at the position of the viewer. So a very interesting conception that really animates the portrait and draws us in as if we are witnessing this delightful game with the artist's three young sisters. It's also considered possibly to, might consider this to be a genre scene as well, for the depiction of the carpet and the chess set and their clothing and hair treatments. So showing us a great deal of everyday life for this family portrait. Self-portraits are also very popular at this time, and as I understand, the exhibition deals more specifically with this theme. I wanted to show this really wonderful late Rembrandt self-portrait. Here, the artist portrays himself with dignity and strength in old age. He appears as a working artist. He's holding brushes and a palette and his maul stick and wearing his studio garb, this simple smock and this head covering. So we're given not only his physical self, but also the artistic and professional concerns that have occupied him throughout his career. That primarily concerns the use of light, how Rembrandt used light and shade to convey subtle aspects of character and mood. The effect is one of silence and all that is implied in quiet contemplation, meditation, and resignation of acceptance, I would argue, of old age. And this is in the Kenwood House collection in London. We have a very different presentation of the presentation of the artist in this self-portrait by Artemisia Gentileschi, an Italian Baroque painter, very accomplished and highly regarded during her lifetime, but posthumously neglected until only quite recently, with her work often attributed to her father, Orazio. This self-portrait was completed in England at the court of Charles I and is now in the Royal Collection. As a woman artist, Artemisia identifies herself here as the female personification of painting. So the title is Self-Portrait as the Allegory of Painting. And the artist has followed the description set out in the Iconologia of Cesar Ripa. So this was an influential emblem book with descriptions and illustrations of the personifications and virtues that could be used by poets and artists. So personifications, how you might represent spring, for instance, in the guise of a young woman. And many of these precedents were taken going back to ancient Rome and Egypt and ancient Greece, and is kind of codified at this time in this very influential book. In the Iconologia, painting is described as, quote, a beautiful woman with full black hair, disheveled and twisted in various ways, with arched eyebrows that show imaginative thought, the mouth covered with a cloth and tied behind her ears, with a chain of gold at her throat, from which hangs a mask, and as written in front, quote, imitation. So Artemisia captures the essentials of this description, leaving out the inscription in the mask and also the gagged mouth, which was intended to symbolize that painting is mute. Painting doesn't speak. But other than that, she seems to have taken the description followed the description very closely with her disheveled hair and the hair color and so on. She holds a brush in one hand and a palette in the other, those important attributes of the painter, and as we saw with the Rembrandt self-portrait. This position would have been extremely difficult for the artist to capture. Yet the work is very economically painted. It's very few pentimenti or areas that have been painted over and repainted. So very little correction. Art historians have found on the work, which is a further, along with this really complicated pose and this illusion of coextensive space, the way that it seems to draw us in almost into three-dimensional space, and the foreshortening of her left arm. All of these are just wonderful demonstrations of her talent, her extraordinary talent. In order to view her own image, she may have arranged two mirrors on either side of herself facing each other, but the angle and position of the head would have been the hardest to accurately render. So quite a challenging pose, and I think a really accomplished self-portraits, requiring very skillful visualization in order to produce this with very little economy. So with great economy, and our attention is directed quite pointedly at the artist herself in this really interesting pose. In a sense, returning to our starting point, this equestrian portrait of Charles I by Anthony van Dyck draws on the long tradition of equestrian portraits going back to ancient Rome. The ruler is in a position of power. This is in the collection of the National Gallery. The head of the horse is quite oddly small, but it's one of several portraits designed to enhance the king's stature. Charles I was only 5'4" but he appears much more imposing mounted on a horse. And this was a very popular and very, very common way to represent the ruler, and perhaps kind of disguise some of those shortcomings. Certain precedents going back to ancient Rome, as I mentioned, but also the Emperor Charles V by Titian, another important precedent for this kind of presentation. Unlike the Augustus Prima Porta, here the ruler is presented as the philosopher king rather than the warrior. He wears a melancholy expression, so he's gazing off into the distance, and it's meant to suggest wisdom. His armor and sword and the proffered helmet reference his command of troops and territory. Unfortunately, unlike the Prima Porta, this equestrian portrait, this portrait of Charles I, was not a predictor of a long and peaceful rule, and things ended, as many of you likely know, quite badly for the English king. Although, as I mentioned at the beginning, there are so many really wonderful examples in the history of portraiture, I'll kind of taper off here with the 18th century and what became known as the grand manner portraiture in England, characterized by large scale, with the large scale figures in relation to the canvas and controlled pose, and often or typically in a landscape setting with a low horizon line. Thomas Gainsborough, the painter of this work, conventionally known as Mr. and Mrs. Andrews, was among the better known who created these portraits in the grand manner, as it was known, although this particular portrait is not exactly representative of the genre. So Mr. and Mrs. Andrews, circa 1750, we have what is essentially a triple portrait. We have Mr. Andrews, and we have Mrs. Andrews, and we have their property, the land, which occupies really half of the canvas. The artist's facility with sumptuous fabrics and landscape painting, which Gainsborough actually preferred, is clear. It's not a very flattering portrait. Mr. Andrews appears rather smug, and Mrs. Andrews has a rather sour expression on her face. And I think it also is subtly telling us that, or the artist is subtly telling us that these are nouveau riche. This is new money, not old money. The positioning of the hunting rifle that Mr. Andrews is holding and the game sack has been seen by art historians as an unflattering comment on Mr. Andrews' masculinity or lack thereof. So contemporary viewers of the painting would have also recognized in the landscape portion and the straight furrows of the crops and the sheep off in the distance. And I'm not sure how much you can see just in this slide, but contemporary viewers would have understood these as references to new technology in machinery that distributes seeds evenly, and enclosures. So both these, so the process by which wealthy landowners would remove access to common land in enclosures, and both of these had enormous consequences for the rural poor. So while portraits like this performed an important social function, conveying mastery and control in the age of revolution, here the artist has cast a critical eye, asserting his own authority to comment on contemporary issues and contemporary political concerns. Something that we will see develop even more fully in the 19th and 20th century, and something that we're very familiar with today, I think. Finally, I do want to mention, just ending with the Riverbrink collection. And here I'm showing you a self-portrait by Zachary Vincent, one of the few works in our collection by Indigenous artists. Vincent became interested in portraiture, in painting, after his portrait was painted by the Quebec painter Antoine Plamondon. The artist was largely self-taught and very prolific. It's a wonderful example of the importance of self-representation. In his portrait by Plamondon, he was not named, but the portrait was titled The Last Huron. And it was purchased from the artist by Lord Durham, the Governor General of Quebec at the time, and taken back to England when Lord Durham went back home. But the experience of having his portrait painted prompted Zachary Vincent to take up a brush and learn, as I said, self-taught himself. And here, as I mentioned, he's taken the opportunity to represent his own version of his own life. And here we see him posed with his son, Cyprien, so clearly not the last Huron. His son represents the next generation. And the presentation of self in terms of his role as a chief of the Huron-Wyandot reserve, an area just outside of Quebec City. So the attributes of the wampum belt, which is around his chest and holding a peace pipe, and his son holding a small bow and arrow, and the silver gorget around his neck, the last element of medieval armor, very popular with the military for a long time following. And then a medallion, a typical gift given by the rulers of Britain and France to signify a relationship with Indigenous peoples in North America. So this is one of many portraits, self-portraits of Vincent, and he went on to have a long and prolific career and many depictions of his community in Wyandot, where, as I said, he did become a chief. So just to sort of fill in a bit of Riverbrink history, as I mentioned, this is one of the few works in our collection by an Indigenous artist. But Sam Weir did have, that is the Riverbrink founder, did have quite a strong interest in portraiture and collected portraits among many other works, and was part of a group that attempted to begin a national portrait gallery in Canada in the mid-1950s, something that didn't go very far, and many of the portraits ended up in the collection of the ROM at that time. So we still the idea of having a national portrait gallery has come and gone over the years, and most recently in the early 2000s, we did have a nascent portrait gallery in Ottawa, but that was canceled. And today there is a project that has come into view now, but it is exclusively an online portrait gallery, the Portrait Gallery of Canada. No physical presence and no collection, but they do have an online presence. So that's where we are with a national portrait gallery. But it's really a very interesting subject. And I'm thanking all of you for joining. And I'm here to answer your questions.
Great, thank you so much, Deborah. It's interesting because in my brain, sculpture and portraits were two different things. And so when I saw that, I was like, oh, right, those are portraits. Like, it just didn't click for me until I saw that. We do have a couple questions here. One, Barbara Worthy was wondering, in the Amilfini portrait, is it possible she's pregnant? And then she just commented that she loved the dog.
Yes, the dog is a symbol of fidelity. And yes, that has been speculation, but no, it's thought that that was the style at the time. I know it is tempting to see that and, oh, it's a marriage portrait, and oh, what's going on there? But it has been sort of dispelled with the type of costumes that they would have worn at that time. But I know the fabric is so wonderful, the rich color and the darling little dog. So much symbolism in that portrait. I didn't get into it, but even the shoes kicked off. Some have seen that as an expression of domesticity, or indeed the standing on holy ground, and a reference to the holy state of matrimony. So there's really a lot to unpack in that particular portrait, but not pregnancy. Actually, I'll just say one of the more interesting and more recent arguments about that was that it's not a marriage contract, but it might be that Arnolfini was designating his wife to act on his behalf as he traveled, and so he was part of the Medici, back and forth to Italy, and a wealthy merchant. So while he was out of town, he conferred upon his wife the authority to act in his behalf. So I think that's an interesting interpretation, but we don't really know.
Ted Rumble asked, when Rembrandt did a self-portrait, He presumably used a mirror. So does the final painting represent a mirror image of what he actually looked like?
I suppose. Yeah, I'm not sure about the technical. Um, I would assume that he's looking in a mirror. Um, or possibly you can look in a mirror and then go back to your canvas. Yeah, I'm not sure. I'll leave that to a painter.
Sandra Lawrence wanted to know, what is the odd small figure below Mr. Andrews in the Gainsborough portrait? Is it significant?
The small figure.
Yeah, odd small figure in below Mr. Andrews in the Gainsborough portrait.
There were animals. I don't know. He's holding the game sack. Yeah, I'm not sure. Does it look like it's a little dog? I can't tell. Yeah, so I'm not sure. Yeah, the portrait is unfinished, and the one area that art historians have been most interested in is Mrs. Andrews' lap. And there's been some speculation that it was intended that she would be holding a dead bird. So she does have a feather in one hand, as if, which is an odd thing for her to be holding in her lap. And, why would this lovely aristocratic lady be holding a dead bird in her lap? Um, but it's part of this supposition that the artist had quite a lot to say about this couple, and they did not like the portrait, and that's why it's not finished. They presumably saw it at some point near the end and decide they didn't like it, and it never went on display until it went up for auction in the early 1920s. So I'm sorry, I can't remember. I can't really figure out what that is, but it's probably a reference to a dog or some other animal, some hunting activity that Mr. Andrews is engaged in. The idea that there would be a dead bird on her lap is just really kind of, I don't know, off-putting.
Yeah, to me, it looked like she was writing with a quill. That's what I just assumed it was. But
Yes, yes. So if you can see it in real life, and it's in the National Gallery in London, I think you get a better sense of those details. That it does look like it might be a quill, but it's actually just the remnant they think of a dead bird.
um, Gail Benjafield wondered, in the early funerary portrait, the eyes of the woman are larger than possible to the face size. Does that have meaning?
I'm not sure. It is a convention of a lot, I don't want to say all, but it is a convention of these portraits. And I don't know if that's a stylistic or if it has, a function in terms of the eyes of the window of the soul. I don't really know, but it's very definitely common in the Fadian portraits to have those really extraordinarily expressive and large eyes.
And Sheila Hill says, did you know that the gown in the Amalfini portrait has been recreated in a program called A Stitch in Time?
Oh, very nice. And um, we're still, but we're not saying it's. Are we? Is there some idea that it's not that she is pregnant? Was there any additional discussion of that, or?
No, I think that was just it. It was
Okay.
just a.
No, I'll have to take a look at that. Thank you. It's a beautiful, beautiful dress.
Craig Tallman asks, is there a significance in the portrait of the young man with his hand on his chest and his third finger tucked under the second? It looks like an unusual pose.
The Botticelli, is that the one?
I'm not sure. Craig, if you could just, um, yeah, probably this one.
I'm not sure. Yeah, one figure. I don't know. There is a great, really interesting book recently published on Botticelli and his depiction of the Divine Comedy, and a lot of exploration of Botticelli's life, but I can't really say specifically about this one.
Great, and I think that's it, unless anyone has any more questions. If you think of something afterwards, feel free to email them through and I can send them to Debra, and I'm sure she wouldn't mind answering some more questions via email. But thank you very much, Debra, for the presentation today. And thanks to everyone for joining us. Our next presentation is next Wednesday, the 31st of January. And we're following along the same theme of our exhibition. So we have Sonia DeLaser, who used to be with Riverbrink, and she's going to present Our Best Face Forward, the Selfie in Visual Culture. Also, if you haven't heard yet about the museum's expansion project, you can find out more about that on our website at notlmuseum.ca, or you can give us a call here at the museum and we'd be happy to chat with you about it. So thanks again for joining us today. We hope to see you online next week as well. And if you want to learn more about the other lectures in the series, those are all on our website as well, notlmuseum.ca. Thanks again, Debra. And
could I just put one plug in for
sure,
our
absolutely.
portraiture? Yeah, so Pete Malagudi is offering a portraiture class at Riverbrink, and it's starting in a couple of weeks. So look on our website for details of that. Thank you.
Riverbrink.org if you want more information.
Great.
Thanks, everyone. Bye, Debra.